If you have a rigorous development process with a lot of guardrails in to protect your code base and a lot of diligence on the part of your team, then you can use these tools successfully to deliver value very quickly. If you're kind of loose about everything, things get chaotic real quick, and AI just makes that happen a lot faster.
Anybody can create a very polished PRD or a spec or any artifact of our work. Just because you could do it fast doesn't mean it's good, right? Doesn't mean it actually does the job it's supposed to do.
Welcome to Pelotalk, an engineering podcast by Pelotech. This is a show about how reorganizations build, ship, and run software in production. Today, we're joined by Michael Luskind, a product leader who has worked across connected vehicles, smart home and security, e-commerce, talent marketplaces, logistics, and fintech. We wanted Michael on because he brings a sharp perspective to a question a lot of teams are wrestling with right now: how AI should actually be used by product engineering teams. In this episode, we'll talk about how AI turned him from a skeptic into a daily user, why demos are easy and production is where things get hard, how instant prototyping erased the friction that forced teams to say no, why AI amplifies culture instead of fixing it, and much more.
You and I have spent a lot of time talking about AI and how AI affects software development and how AI affects product. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is both of us in particular, and Joachim as well, occupy the space of incredibly cynical and jaded and questioning of any new technology that's going to change the world, cough, blockchain, cough, NFTs, but also, enthusiastically adopting AI tooling. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? Like, what's your take there? Like, how are you using AI, and how do you think about AI as like intrinsically somewhat cynical about these things?
Yeah, I think I'm going to probably have to challenge you on that. As much as I love to be cynical as like a pastime, I think with AI, every time we had a sense of like a baseline of like where it could do something that we wanted, where it was wrong, how much like the level of effort that would have to go into making it kind of do the thing you wanted it to do, and did that really save you time, or did that just push the effort to the output side, and like you spend all your time editing something and trying to get it to work. I think the models jumped and we got to to a place where effectively some of the stuff I was trying like a year ago I can one shot now. I think it's the same questions still pervade around like I think the economics of it. Like First of all, is the thing you're working on or the thing you want to do, like, can AI actually help you with that? Or are you what you're really trying to solve is just like a very deterministic thing that needs just a really simple rules engine, but you're so like excited by capabilities in AI and you want to add some sort of feature where you can then put that you're like AI enabled and you have a co-pilot too and whatever. I think just being like, I think that's where not even cynicism, but maybe, I know every cynic says they're a realist, but like, I think that's where the realism lives, is like just really being very thoughtful about what you're going to get for the effort. And does the problem you're trying to solve actually need AI capabilities before you even get into the like token efficiency economics of what does this look like at scale with our customer base and where we're going to grow to? Like, is this going to make sense? We're going to be testing with frontier models, but then like that's not going to scale. Okay, we have a harness in place for all the agentic stuff we're doing. How much does that like really reduce token spend per every like increment of work and reasoning that needs to happen? How much of it can then be like a determined, controlled, rule-based thing, and where do we then really need the AI in this more complex world? I don't know, but going back to vibes for a second, like I can't in good conscience like be as cynical as I was before. It's just like it's just too valuable in day-to-day work. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's like enough.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a big struggle that we've had articulating to people in general, is just it is both a transformative, amazing technology and not the thing a lot of the people are hyping up and selling,
I think
it changes everything about how you develop software, but it's also not God or whatever some of these folks who are really on the hype train are claiming, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting part. Like as a PM, it's one thing for me to like, oh holy shit, I can do like 10 divergent prototypes at the same time. And then I could like really quickly see what's working or what's not, even like at the experiential level, which back like before I just took too much time. You have to be like way more focused about what is the thing you kind of want to test. You have some kind of evidence-backed thing, or are you just running off like your own experience and taste where you're like, I think there's something here, let me try it. But then the effort. Here, it's like, nope, I can spin it up. I have 10 versions. I can borrow a few things from each and then try a new variant. And that gets you so far. Even, early days of like GPT, what was it? 3.5, I think I really started using it a lot in research. And then back then, all the conversation across, especially UX teams, the people whose livelihood was very much research, right? It was like, well, you would see all these write-ups. Here's where it went wrong. There is how, like, yes, it helps you categorize some things. It helps you create some themes and helps you affinity map some stuff. But then you still need to bottom up, do the work yourself the way we used to, on a whiteboard or, a wall where you have sticky notes and you're like, okay, I think this one belongs here and this means that. And like, oh, okay, patterns. What does that mean? How true is this thing? What tests can we build that would like cheaply then test that thing that we think we're seeing?
Yeah.
They just got way better at that out of the box now. And the effort has moved to just effectively creating the guidelines around how you want them to operate, right? Mm-hmm. You no longer need to walk them by the hand and make sure they don't fall over on like, every step of the way. You could level up now and give them the same kind of guidelines, right? That you would give maybe a junior researcher or a junior product person. Be like, here's why we're doing this work. Here's the way to think about it. Here's what kind of good looks like here and some examples of that. This is the format I want. This is kind of the way I think about it because it's kind of tailored also to the way I work, and go do that. Mm-hmm. And it now comes back with things that are, you still check, but like the bar of quality and has improved. Like hallucinations, the way we used to talk about them before, has been reduced just off that kind of workflow with the models. So the utility is there, the value is there, and the big win is just the speed at which you can then test, right? And learn, like build to learn before you start getting into like, okay, we're gonna start demoing the productized version of this, right? Like building it on the stack we have in production and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a thing you encounter a lot these days is this dream of the product engineer, where you're both a product specialist and an engineer, and you're gonna take one of those prototypes and just ship it into production. And I think, there's a lot of value in those in doing that work. There's a lot of learning. You learn a lot of stuff you can throw away. Like, I mean, I think a huge benefit you see is there's a lot of stuff you don't need to explore. If you have an LLM prototype out 10 approaches, you can drop 5 of those approaches or pieces of 5 of those approaches before you engage a developer at all. But I think the idea that you can take those and just ship them directly to production, we're still a ways away from that from a technology standpoint, right?
Yeah, I think maybe that's where when we start thinking about like the next step, right? Like actually demoing something. I think this is where things get a little tricky with some teams, because the problems we had before haven't like completely just magically disappeared, right? Like only thinking in terms of happy paths, right? Not thinking about the scale you're actually going to be launching to, right? Like what it needs to do in production, where it can't afford to go wrong, right? And what do we have in place to make sure that doesn't happen? Like the instrumentation around that, starting not just in production, but much earlier now, right? And like every builder is now coming around, or I mean, a lot have come around, but the long tail of it is like moving towards realizing you need those skills and you need to think in those terms much earlier in the development process. It's not something you can just be like, well, it's binary, it works or it doesn't, and it's shit, right? Those days are, unless you're working on a feature that is that, those days have kind of gone.
Anything more complicated than a pretty simple calculator app, you can't really answer that question in an easy way. One of the things we found super helpful for that is just a lot of the same CI/CD tooling we put in place to make developers' lives easier, so you just don't have to think about stuff, right? So if you force test coverage, or you force complexity limits, or you force all kinds of rules in your check pipeline, like a pre-commit hook or something, then when the AI is the one doing the development, it'll follow those same rules as well. It'll run into the same guardrails that a developer would run into. And we put in a lot of that technology so that we wouldn't have to think about that stuff or be diligent all the time. But it's been really helpful for LLMs as well. I think there was a report recently about like the same things that lead to good DORA metrics lead to good AI utilization. Like we're seeing teams that adopt that more successful than teams that are not. We also, on the flip side, you see a lot of teams who are kind of YOLOing it before with their code and like throwing some AI YOLOing on top of that. Just madness. I don't know if you're encountering any of that.
Yeah, I think, on your, side of it, where you're like rigorously thinking about the, development, to production, and then what happens there, you can see where, like the culture that the team operates in, like to your point, if it's kind of loosey goosey and a lot of things can kind of slip, those things can seriously compound in a way that
Fast.
can really, but can damage your business in a way that, like, before it was easy to wrap your mind around the thing that would go wrong and contextualize the significance of it. Now there's just, the cognitive load, the complexity of thinking through that has increased, right? Right. What's the distribution of the, of the answers you're going to get? Like, how often is it within the realm of what we would consider the correct or right or appropriate answer, and how often is it coloring outside those lines, and what's the significance of that, and how do we measure that? And then way before in the process is that hopefully there were gates to catch that. Like, it doesn't meet that bar. It can never be wrong about this thing. We could never have a generative element in this workflow around any of these critical decision points, because we do that once and we lose customers, right? Like, you think of any regulated industry, right? You think of healthcare, you think of government, you think of anywhere where there is consequence, right? Beyond like consumer apps where like, we could live with it, we can iterate.
Yeah, I mean, and you're seeing I've seen some articles on wild cases there, right? Like AI, LLM based hiring bots. If you change one character in a person's name to go from a woman's name to a man's name, suddenly it rates them, 20% higher as a, correct candidate. And you're like, whoa, man, like we can't be shipping stuff like that. Like, that's not going to work. So I totally hear you on that. I think one of the things you talked about before is just how it's helping you prototype things. I think a pattern we've seen over the years, especially, is like, for a lot of folks, talking about like the abstract concepts of things is very difficult. The abstract idea of something, how something might work, is very difficult. And if you can bring a prototype into the room and show everyone, hey, it's going to work something like this, it's going to do something like this, that just clicks for a lot of people. They're just thinking very concretely about it, and being able to see it makes it feel real. But one of the challenges we've seen is that sometimes when it feels real, it feels too real. I know we talked a little bit about like that's something that happens with AI prototypes, but what else are you seeing? What are you seeing that, like, does it really help with the communication between the sort of non-product and engineering involved stakeholders who kind of need to see it to get it? Or are you seeing a lot more, oh, that looks great, ship it, or oh, the fonts are wrong, change the fonts, change the colors, tweak this thing, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's the double-edged sword of it. It's, we've always operated under this kind of mantra of like show, don't tell, right? Like, that's the most powerful way to convince when you make something tangible. And certainly across my career, that's always proven true. Before, you would just have to consider, is this the right fidelity? Like, is the conversation I want to have, suited, or rather the other way around, like the conversation I want to have, the decision I want to align on and have some stakeholder or the team align on, is this thing just way too polished and it's going to skew that conversation, right? Where their mind is going to see something pretty and looks like it's fully baked, and they'll talk about absolutely the wrong thing, where I wanted to talk about maybe basic flows, basic user experience, or the data that we're working with along the way, right? Just like as a way to visualize actual work with data, what surfaced where, how it's transformed that level of conversation.
Well, and for folks who weren't around in that era, like a big thing we tried to do was use tools that would intentionally produce lower fidelity mockups, things like Balsamic, where it'd be like Comic Sans fonts and black and white UI. But even then, you'd still get feedback from stakeholders that were like, yeah, I love everything about it. I'm not in love with this like cartoon looking UI. They'd be like, it doesn't have enough color. And you're like, hey, we're not operating at that level of fidelity.
Yeah,
get rid of the Latin everywhere.
That was always amazing. Even when we used Balsamic, and it's like, this is so ridiculous. It's like a caricature of a thing, of an experience you'd want. And still people would latch onto that. They're like, yeah, all of the logic makes sense, but like, does it have to be boxes with X's across them? Like,
anyway, you were saying about how that plays out.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I think with the AI, that's like the double-edged sword, is like anybody can now create something that looks really, really good. And it's not even just like prototypes, right? Anybody can create a very polished PRD or a spec or any artifact of our work, right? And, just because you could do it fast doesn't mean it's good, right? Doesn't mean it actually does the job it's supposed to do, which is like, a mechanism for learning something or aligning people on something, so that then we can move fast as a team and do the thing that's valuable and important, and we'll make our customers happy, and we'll grow the business, and all the things that we're trying to achieve every time we pick a problem to work on. So, any function, any person in the company building something that maybe uses your design system, because you plug that in, rightly so, and maybe even leverages your code base because you've plugged that in, rightly so. And now you have something that is functional and looks right and looks no different than the rest of your product. And so I think part of it is like there's now this like emotional attachment to the thing you made, right? It's you want to walk it back to like, cool, let's try to understand what is this actually trying to address, right? Like what is the problem we're solving so we can agree on that and then think about, is this the best way to solve that problem? But now it's...
I think on that note, a question that I would have, and I think at least I hope maybe it's related, or either that or my brain's just completely in a different space. But it kind of touches into when you end up having things that are that fidelity and that people do get attached to. Like in the past, there'd be tons of times where you'd like talk through things, whatever. And as an organization, you'd be like, no, let's not do that. Like, we're not going to do that because the cost of developing it further to like quote unquote completion was more in the mind of like, oh, there's this cost that's going to get associated with building it. Is it really worth doing? And the maintenance cost and the holding of that or not maybe that capital, but the holding of that product or the features or whatnot for a long period of time, it oftentimes gets lost. But at least that like initial development like piece kind of put a little bit of friction to not just developing things and being like, oh, it's close enough. Let's just deploy it. Let's get it out there. Like, are you seeing anything in that space of where people are just being like, oh, let's just add more, let's add more and let's add more because it's so close or it's so attached or whatnot that they're like, the saying no to that feature or that capabilities or refining it and maybe collapsing 5 things into one or reducing like where the benefit is. It's almost like the code is so cheap now that it's just pushing it out there, but then it's like, wait a second, there's a cost to maintaining it. So eventually there's going to be that cost hit. But I guess I have a sneaking suspicion that it's a yes, but I guess I don't know what you've seen.
Yeah, I think it changes kind of team to team and the kind of work you're doing. If it's kind of a very product-minded culture and everybody's really aligned on like what we're trying to solve as a business, and it's very easy to rally around, the person, whether it's the PM or, somebody in engineering or designer or wherever good ideas come from around what's worth solving and how to start thinking about it, that has a drive of its own and you can rally around it if you have that product culture. When you don't, then it's, it breaks down to key stakeholders who've maybe prototyped something and they bring it in and they're like this, right? Like the fundamentals haven't changed, right? People still talk, it's really hard to get people to move away from talking in terms of solutions. Now they have like a much better to give everybody something of like a higher fidelity around that. And then the question isn't, let's walk it back and really ground ourselves in why we're doing what we're doing. It's now like, oh, and this, and this, and this. Like, let's just add more capabilities. It's so easy to build capabilities. Why don't we just do that, right? And
you run into it's kind of the same pattern we were just talking about on the development side, right? If you have a rigorous development process with a lot of guardrails in to protect your code base and a lot of diligence on the part of your team, then you can use these tools successfully to deliver value very quickly. If you're kind of loose about everything and you're kind of cowboying everything and you don't have a lot of guardrails, then things get chaotic real quick, and AI just makes that happen a lot faster. You see the same sort of thing, it sounds like, on the product side, right? Is if you're operating as a feature factory that's like, to get new customers, we need to add 10 new features and we just need to keep doing that for every 5 new customers, then you're going to feature factory 1,000 times faster and have this, kraken of software very quickly from a, scope perspective. But if you're diligent and thoughtful and you think through your problems and you're tightening down and you're trying to, simplify the product as you go, then this tool can make you more successful at that. I mean, I think it is really interesting because a lot of folks seem to think, oh, we'll just throw AI at it and it'll solve those problems. And one of the things I feel like I've seen, at least, is it's going to do what you tell it to do. So if you have a problem, it's going to make that problem 10 times bigger, 10 times faster, right?
Yeah, I think the baseline is moving, right? Like what the AI tools give you, because it's trained on the corpus of all of our data and all of the articles that have ever been written and blog posts and videos on like what good product is. When it doesn't conflate
bad articles too, right?
Yeah, so when it doesn't conflate project and product thinking, right? When it doesn't conflate like solutioning and problem, you can still get it to maybe increase your baseline. But then that means that team was that org, that team was already operating in something I know we've all experienced in a kind of a hell, where it's like personality. It's like all the things, some flavor of the things we've all experienced, right? It's like personality driven, solution driven, not a lot of critical thinking and leadership and judgment and taste in the mix. It's like brute force, kind of grit, convoluted internal processes to get things done, and then just like ship, and then things will break, and then we'll maintain it, and we'll fix it, and we'll duct tape everywhere. So it's, that baseline is going up with these tools, right? But that's a world away from the teams that are like moving fast and actually building valuable things, because it accelerated good product thinking, right? And like good judgment, and the ability, folks who critically think through what they're doing and why they're doing, and is it the right thing to do at every step of the way, right? They're not just like following a process, right? So I think that's, the baseline has moved, or it's moving up across the board. But I think that gap between, strong product teams that have autonomy, can figure things out, and, folks that are still kind of in process mode, I think it hasn't really changed that basic DNA, right? Because that's cultural. That's not like AI isn't going to shift culture.
Yeah, and I think that's, I guess, what I'm calling out is it feels like, in the belief that it's going to fix everything, there's a belief that it'll fix culture, and culture under everything, it doesn't change. There's still someone directing the AI, and they have a perspective, right?
Yeah. Where did you guys see in those terms? Like, is it because it's kind of papering over that in a lot of places, where it gives you the false sense that now you're just like way more capable? I mean, up to a certain point you are, but like in terms of just delivering everything, internally building, creating the right artifacts, connecting things, and then shipping things continuously, right? Like you've now tightened that loop. You can just do more throughput, right? More volume. Are you finding that those places are just like more resistant to the real work that they never did, right? Like the cultural change, the leadership work,
I think it goes back a little bit to what you were saying about like the polish, right? One of the things I feel like, you understand, if you've been in the industry for a few years, that beautiful products are less buggy than ugly products, regardless of the number of bugs, right? Like, we just give more slack, for lack of a better term, to something that looks nice and looks polished and looks complete. And I think we haven't adjusted for the AI patterns of some of that yet. So one of the things you'll see is a lot, as you said, is a lot of really polished documents that don't really say a lot, right? And folks who are confusing the form for the content, where they get a little sucked into like, oh, now we have all these great PR, so we must have solved the underlying, feature factory problem, or the underlying, we don't really know what our customers want problem, or, we're being led by the nose by different parts of the organization. We must have solved that problem because our documents all look great. And the answer is like, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Maybe you have a bunch of empty documents that are completely AI generated with no meaning at all, right?
I would say it's strongly tied to organizations that are like quantity versus quality. And unfortunately, AI makes it appear the shape of quality, no matter whether it is or not. So you end up having all of a sudden now, especially organization that where they're like, okay, how much can you get done? Not like how much valuable stuff, but just how much stuff do you get done? And I think you see this especially in organizations that are more bureaucratic in nature. So bureaucratic organizations tend to like moving paper around. So the quantity of paper you move around, whether the paper has any value or not, is completely irrelevant. It's like, how much paper are you moving around? Then in that context, all of a sudden AI is magical. It creates a ton more paper. And if you squint, it looks good quality. But as soon as you start digging into it, you're like, wait, I just read 100 pages that says nothing. If you were like, hey, summarize this. And if you took like AI and said, hey, grab all this, summarize this, it would say like, oh, here's one sentence. So you've now just kind of like created this mass amount of like quantity of stuff because that's what the organization values. And then at the end, it doesn't really do anything. Now in reverse, I think that there's a lot of like organizations where if you value quality and diligence, and you can actually say, okay, how can I refine this to have a lot more quality things? In totality, I think it's a lot less compared to like the quantity and that doesn't have quality. But I think you can get a lot more quality if that's your focus. But I think the organizations have to understand what quality is and what quantity is. And
yeah, I think a real To be a little more concrete there, like a real challenge is heavy bureaucracy organizations have often relied on the polish or length of documents to indicate the amount of thinking you've done, because to write that much, you have to do a certain amount of thinking, right? And so they're like, look, we don't necessarily universally have the expertise to evaluate the claims you're making in this document. But we do have project managers that can look at the document and say, there's a lot of thought that went into this, and there's, a lot of structure in the thinking. So therefore, there is meaningful, valuable, structured thinking going on here. I don't know exactly what these developer yahoos are talking about in this massive architecture document, because I don't really follow the technology that they're talking about. But I do know that they've structured it in a thoughtful way, and they've written a lot, so they must have done a lot of thinking. And those assumptions are just gone now, right? And I think it's going to be a while before we adapt to that for those organizations. And I think it's going to be a little bit of an interesting ride in the meantime.
Yeah, I think there's like another element to this that I've heard from some leaders in orgs talk about with, pretty explicitly sometimes, which is an acknowledgement around the high variability of skills across their teams. And like, they acknowledge that, well, we can't operate the way these like tier one companies or these fast moving product companies operate. They understand the limitations of like this large bureaucratic organization, the culture, even to the talent that they attract. Right. And so they, in some cases, because it's way more costly to say like, but we're going to figure out how to transform and figure out that path, So the easier answer is just to resign yourself to like, that's not going to happen. So where can we win given what we have? And that's investment in like, guardrails, right? Like back to my earlier point of like, well, we can guardrail the process to have this baseline. And that baseline is good enough, chances are it's way better than what we had before, or measurably better than what we had before in terms of speed and quality, right? Like less assumptions are missed across all these projects because now we have tools that can surface the implicit gaps in thinking or the explicit misses in the data that they're not thinking about, or the regulatory constraints that like this product has to operate under when it's released into this market, right? Like there are those guardrails, and that on its own is pretty valuable, right? If you have the data and you've structured the system effectively enough to surface these things, when your teams are thinking through what they're going to build and how they're going to build it, that data is there for them. So I think that becomes very alluring, right? Because that's already kind of a measurable improvement. It's a win. It's a win for the org. It's a win for the sponsors of it, right? They can say before me this, after me with these systems, look how much faster we're launching. And sure, it's like, could it be better? Maybe, but it serves the job, right? It less buggy than before, less misses earlier in the process than before, right? When it was a lot more costly to factor them into the architecture. I mean, even with AI, it's still a cost. If you didn't think through like, oh shit, there are these regulatory requirements that like weave their way throughout how the system has to work, and like we just missed it until we're like building. Still costly. So, I guess one other way of looking at it is that not a significant enough win? Is that not a good enough win? The before and after?
Yeah, I mean, as long as that is working, right? And the example of the bureaucratic org, they've lost something, right? Like they maybe didn't have the ability to evaluate the content of the thinking, but they could validate that people were doing some amount of thinking. Now they can't do that anymore. So their overall ability to evaluate this process is now broken, right? Is that true across all orgs? No, but I mean, I think one of the things you see in orgs that have resigned themselves to mediocrity, I mean, I think there are a lot of challenges with orgs that have resigned themselves to mediocrity. I've worked with teams on all kinds of products, on all kinds of pay tier levels, in all kinds of cities and environments around the world. And I think resigning yourself to mediocrity is just terrible, to be honest. I think everyone can improve. Everyone can do a better job. Everyone who's really invested in the work that they're doing will bring their whole self to work and do cooler, better stuff. So I think there is, I have a framing challenge with a lot of that. But I also think people are kind of, if you're like, yeah, we have a mediocre team, they deliver mediocre results, and now they're delivering mediocre AI generated results, like you don't necessarily have a feedback loop because your evaluation cycle is just like, I don't really care, or my boss thinks I'm an idiot anyway. So like, are they actually improving, or do they just look like they're improving? Like one of the challenges we see, like a great example is recently that people were talking about all these AI generated flyers everywhere. And yeah, they like look cooler and fancier, but like, do they say anything more? Are they better in any way? Like, are customers like, oh yeah, I want to go eat a hamburger from a place that's very clearly AI generated a picture of a hamburger, so I have no idea what their hamburgers are actually like? And I don't know that just having the trappings of competence is bringing competence to those teams, or having the trappings of, like, if you're writing great looking PRDs, but you're still kind of phoning it in from a reading the PRD perspective or a thinking about the PRD perspective, are they just pushing around artifacts that no one's really looking at?
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to the kind of cultural question that's a lot harder to shift. But I would say that, I don't think it's just, faster mediocrity necessarily. I think it's easy to like dismiss it, but I think it depends how you're building that capability internally, right? Like who's responsible for that, I think has a lot of power to change how things operate across a lot of different teams. So it's kind of like, you can kind of Trojan horse this in if you have leadership on that level that sees that opportunity, because that is I think a significant way that meaningful change can happen. Because if you think about that product person now, or, a highly variable, group of product people, some came from business analysts, some are TPMs, some came, as business owners, whatever their background is, whatever they're good at, wherever they have, some gaps in their experience and knowledge. And we're not assuming bad intent here, or we're not assuming that like nobody wants to learn.
Yeah.
People want to get better at what they do. It's just like environments beat people down, misaligned incentives beat people down. Like, we know these things. But if you design these systems thoughtfully, well, now you have PMs that, okay, they're putting together their initial thinking, maybe in the early kind of PRD, let's say. Maybe they're not prototyping anything yet. They're still structuring out the problem. Well, now you can kind of surface, well, as you're writing, here are kind of some questions, right? Like guided coaching you can build into the product. The big thing we always kind of talked about with coaching and workshops and webinars and all these things is it was like a snapshot in time. You retain something, you don't immediately see how you apply it to your work, and it gets lost. Now we know if you do this thoughtfully, you can actually bring those things into the work. Like, don't boil the ocean with it. Try to be like, we're going to go from zero to like the best product teams in the world. But like, where specifically can we improve people? And then as they're working, there are these moments of insight where they can improve their critical thinking, improve their judgment, right? You still need people internally who define, this is the thing that doesn't go away, but it's now called out, who internally owns quality, who says what good looks like as a baseline for everybody else. Like, that is meaningful now. You have to point to somebody who explicitly outright owns that, and they're like continuously working on that criteria, improving those examples. It's not a snapshot in time. It's growing as the organization grows. So you do that around the product development process, and now you have people who just get way more, like a ton of reps thinking through everything. Not only that, if you have the infrastructure and the data, I mean, all these places do. It's just like an integration problem. It's like a willingness and integration problem. They have it. It's, well, as you're writing it, there are actually some SMEs you should talk to, because a lot of these are requirements. Talk to some SMEs internally is like a very common enterprise requirement. But now you can get some context on why you should talk to them. You can see past projects where we learned something about this type of problem or this problem specifically. You can see all of the, regulations and compliance and, beyond just fundamental product thinking. Like, all these things can come into one surface where you can think through them in a way that if you didn't know, you wouldn't do it, because you'd have to hunt it down. Or, like we talked about before, the missed assumptions would just show themselves up. Like, if you didn't catch it.
Yeah, way late in the process.
Yeah. If somebody across the whole team didn't catch this as you were working on it, it would just come up like when you run head first into it as like an immovable thing you have to navigate.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about sounds a little like, we haven't talked about it in the context of AI, but it seems like now that we're changing the process for how teams operate and we're injecting new tooling in their workflow, we have opportunities to do what is essentially harness engineering for our teams, right? Like you would harness engineer in Airflow, you have opportunities to inject questions or areas to explore, or even checklists, dare I say, into steps of the process in a way that was really hard to do in the past, right? Like, organizations weren't really happy to just switch up their process or inject a bunch of tooling everywhere, or say, oh, we're going to offer you all these touch points to interact with the team. But now that every organization is adopting AI tools and every organization's process is changing, whether they wanted to or not, there are openings to to inject some of that into their process as well, because now everyone has all these touch points, right? Like everyone in the product process is interacting with their AI agent. And so some of that's intrinsic to the agent, but some of that stuff you're bringing to the table, or they're bringing to the table to improve their process, right? If they find everyone seems to forget internationalization when they're developing features, it's very easy to be like, okay, we're going to have a step where we interact with an AI around internationalization and we make sure we cover these 20 topics, right?
Yeah, I think it's actually amazing, the opportunities that exist now to change how, these companies operate. And it's not like, leaders across these companies don't want that. It's just that, there has to be a concrete path of how you get there, but that they can rally around, right? It has to be something that where the dots are connected. You can see how it compounds. You start in a way that can lead to a win that isn't like, well, if we do this right at every step of the way, in a year, we could have this. It has to be, where can we show that the ideas here work now in some form?
Yeah.
And I think, there's a lot of openness to that, right? It's translating that, rooting it in their context, in their reality, in the specific problems and opportunities that exist like in the company itself, and not like the cookie cutter. I mean, if we've all read enough marketing content by like every vendor pre-AI and now with AI about like all the things it would solve, and like if you only implement this and just
$29.99 a month, and your company will not have any problems ever again.
yeah, you'll like evaluate all the right things, you'll observe all the right things. The things that haven't changed is like, what are the right things, right?
Yeah.
Like the definitions, the work to really think through that hasn't changed. And it's not something you can outsource to a tool or a model. Like, you have to do that work. You brainstorm with it, sure. You research with it, sure. But it has to be you, it has to be your team, it has to be your org. Otherwise, if you miss that part, then you kind of screwed downstream in significant ways, because you've like abdicated like the core strategic part of the work. Right, then you're just like jumping straight to process and production.
Yeah.
We know what that looks like.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm appreciating out of this conversation is the whole aspect. And sometimes it's just easy to forget, but it's this thing of like, hey, how do you continuously improve like just organizations in general? Especially it's because that's tends to be like what we geek out upon a bunch in just in general. And so sometimes I guess I get stuck in this loop of like, oh, there's a new thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that's cool. But it's not like, there's the like reality of what it brings, there's a hype of what it brings, and then there's the like all the ways you can shoot yourself in the foot depending on if you do it wrong or right or whatever it is. But the truth of it is like, and I think probably talking a little bit to Kav of like, the organizations are just, resigned to not being any better. Well, if they're resigned to not being better, like the only way that there's probably an option for them to think about getting better is for something fundamentally to shift. Whether they're right about the shift or not is like almost like real. The fact that there's a shift provides an opportunity to inject and to like sneak in like the correct changes into it. And maybe the likelihood for success is really low, but at least it's not zero, which without that, it would be zero. They'd just be like, well, there's no reason to change. It just is the same. There's no like, it's just like a race down off a cliff, like that's really slow. And in this context, it's like, well, we're racing towards a cliff. Hopefully there's a bridge that'll be there by the time we get to the cliff, and then it'll be like really rad and we'll just go flying across it. But at least it's not just a slow dive.
Yeah, and and it's not just like external folks coming in and either like having an explicit mandate to do this, which is a lot fewer of the companies bring people in explicitly around this. The majority is usually bringing around something more scoped and concrete in some part of the org. It's not like this, let's transform this so we can leverage all these new capabilities and like really figure out what they can do today and maybe future proof for like where things are likely going. It's like, we need to ship that thing. We need your expertise to ship that thing. And then, and then there are obviously just internal teams that just folks, right, who are curious and see this and they're like, this can help me today. And through that process, eventually they evangelize, the natural organic growth. I mean, either they see it and do it explicitly at some point, or just like the natural organic growth of something valuable and measurable you can point to that then is hard to ignore internally, and people will start adopting it across teams. Before those wins, like up until, I guess the last tranche of that was like the wins around Kubernetes, right? Like it got proven by internal teams doing it, whether they had any external expertise or not. They just showed you how things could be, how much simpler and more maintainable infrastructure could be in your org. And measurably what that means. I think that's going to happen, it's happening now in places. It's going to continue to happen now. I think, from the outside in, it's still that part of like the systems level evaluation of a place. Like, the place where you look at, leadership, you talk to folks, you interview people, you understand incentives, you understand how they operate, and you realize, okay, in this particular place, the probability of this working is pretty low. That's the reality, despite, wishful thinking or just like power through. It's good to have some understanding of reality and like probabilities in these places. But then the win is maybe at the team level, right? Maybe it's more localized. And maybe those things live beyond the work you're doing, just like Kubernetes, but kicked off by maybe some teams internally around some work, some workload, some process, and then spread, right? They weren't selling on like a huge migration of like, this is how the world is going to work now everywhere all at once.
Yeah,
I think
and even if you don't change even if you don't change the course of a company's trajectory with something like Kubernetes, you can change the course of a team's, you can change the course of an individual's career. You can, there's an unlock there. And I think, at times it gets a little frustrating to hear AI from every. On the other hand, it's really nice not to be hearing anymore, oh, we don't do that here. Oh, we don't do that here. Oh, we don't do it this way here. Oh, we've been doing it this way for the last 15 years and we will continue to do it this way, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not hearing a lot of that anymore from anyone.
That's a good point.
And I enjoy that. I enjoy the fact that everyone's recognizing things are changing, even if some folks are believing it's gonna transform a little more than I do. But I've been wrong before.
Well, I think it makes sense. Like the folks that were still moving slow with the DevOps of it all are now got hit really hard with the pace of AI. And if you want to leverage most of those capabilities at scale, well, guess what you need, right? Like,
it is true that these like adopting thoughtful automation over the years has made it easier, and guardrails and all the things we talked about makes it easier to take the next step, makes it easier to take the next step, makes it easier to take the next step. And resisting everything all the way, you sort of prove yourself right. It's one of these, like, regardless of what you believe, you're going to be right. So, maybe try to make your life, your coworkers' lives, your customers' lives a little bit better every day, and you'll be a lot happier than just trying to fight against it all.
I think that's the baseline to it all.
Cool.